For the first time in its entire operational history, a weapon that had spent years sitting quietly in the American arsenal, tested, validated, cleared for combat, but never actually used against a real target in a real war, just got dropped on Iran. The GBU-72 Advanced 5K Penetrator, a 5,000-pound bunker-busting bomb specifically engineered to punch through concrete and rock before detonating deep underground, made its combat debut against hardened Iranian missile sites along the coastline near the Strait of Hormuz. Central Command confirmed the strike directly, stating that American forces had successfully employed multiple deep penetrator munitions against underground storage facilities holding coastal defense cruise missiles and related support equipment. Weapons? Iran has spent years positioning specifically to threaten naval and commercial vessels, transiting one of the most economically critical waterways on the planet. This wasn't just another night of strikes in a war that's already produced thousands of them. This was the debut of an entirely new tool in America's bunker-busting arsenal, one specifically designed to close a capability gap that's existed for decades, and understanding exactly why that gap mattered and why Iran's underground coastal missile network specifically became the target chosen for this weapon's first combat use tells you a lot about how this entire war has actually been fought at the technical level. Let's start with understanding what the GBU-72 actually is, because it represents a genuinely important evolution in how the American military approaches the problem of deeply buried, hardened targets. Development on this weapon began back in 2017, specifically as part of a broader effort to modernize American bunker penetration capability for a world where more and more adversaries were building exactly the kind of underground, hardened military infrastructure that conventional weapons simply couldn't reliably defeat. It underwent extensive testing and validation at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, and was formally cleared for operational combat use back in October of 2021, meaning this weapon had been sitting ready, fully certified, and available for roughly 4.5 years before it was ever actually used in anger. That's a long gap between certification and combat debut, and it tells you something important. The weapon existed specifically as a hedge, a capability held in reserve for exactly the kind of scenario that eventually materialized once this current phase of conflict with Iran kicked off in earnest back in March of 2026. Technically, the GBU-72 is built around a design philosophy that's worth understanding in detail because it's genuinely clever engineering. The weapon weighs approximately 5,000 pounds, roughly 2,300 kilograms, and it's constructed using a modified version of the guidance and tail kit originally developed for the 2,000-pound Joint Direct Attack munition, essentially scaling up a proven, reliable guidance system to control a much heavier weapon. It uses GPS and inertial navigation guidance, giving it the kind of precision targeting that's become standard across modern American precision-guided munitions, and it can be carried by a range of different aircraft, including the B-1B Lancer bomber, and both the F-15E and F-15I strike fighters, giving military planners genuine flexibility in how they actually deliver this weapon, depending on the specific mission requirements and the threat environment involved. Boeing designed the weapon specifically to replace the aging GBU-28, a laser-guided bunker buster that's been in continuous American service since 1991, first used during the Gulf War and subsequently employed in conflicts stretching from the broader Middle East through to strikes against Hezbollah leadership positions in Beirut. The GBU-72 was engineered to offer substantially higher lethality against deeply buried and fortified targets than that older weapon, representing roughly 3.5 decades of accumulated lessons about exactly what does and doesn't work when you're trying to destroy something an adversary has deliberately buried underground, specifically to survive conventional bombardment. The actual mechanics of how this weapon achieves its effect are worth walking through carefully, because the physics here matter enormously for understanding why this specific weapon was chosen for this specific mission. According to defense analysts who've studied the weapon's design, the GBU-72 is capable of plunging through roughly 100 feet of earth before detonating, at which point its warhead functions in what's called a post-penetration detonation, meaning the explosive charge doesn't go off on impact or even immediately after breaching the surface. It continues driving downward until it's genuinely buried within whatever structure or storage facility it's targeting, and only then does it explode. That timing is absolutely critical to the weapon's effectiveness. A bomb that detonates too early, even just a few feet short of its intended target, wastes the vast majority of its destructive energy on collapsing rock and soil that would have been destroyed anyway, rather than actually rupturing the hardened chamber or tunnel system it was aimed at. By trapping its explosive energy underground, precisely inside or immediately adjacent to the target structure, the weapon essentially uses the surrounding earth and rock as a pressure vessel, containing and concentrating the blast wave in a way that dramatically amplifies its destructive effect against whatever's actually inside, compared to a conventional bomb that simply detonates near the surface and lets most of its energy dissipate harmlessly into open air. Now let's talk about exactly what this weapon was used against in its combat debut, because the target set tells you a lot about the specific strategic problem American planners were trying to solve. Iran has spent years building out a network of coastal defense cruise missile sites positioned specifically to threaten shipping traffic, transiting the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical choke points in the entire global economy, through which a massive share of the world's seaborne oil exports passes every single day. Rather than keeping these missile systems out in the open, where they'd be relatively easy to spot and destroy using conventional airstrikes, Iran positioned significant portions of this coastal missile network inside hardened underground storage facilities built directly into the rock and terrain along its southern coastline. That's a deliberate defensive strategy, one that mirrors the broader pattern we've seen throughout this entire conflict of Iran, relying on concealment and hardened construction, rather than open confrontation, to protect its most strategically valuable military assets. Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane confirmed the specifics of this particular strike directly during a Pentagon briefing alongside Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, stating plainly that American forces had dropped 5,000-pound penetrator weapons into underground storage facilities holding coastal defense cruise missiles and other support equipment, describing the weapons as bespokely designed to get through concrete and rock and to continue functioning properly after penetrating those barriers, a direct reference to exactly the kind of post-penetration detonation mechanism that makes the GBU-72 so effective against this specific category of target. It's worth pausing here to understand why this particular category of Iranian capability, coastal defense cruise missiles specifically, has become such a persistent priority throughout this entire war, because it connects directly to the broader economic stakes involved in keeping the Strait of Hormuz open and functioning. Unlike Iran's longer-range ballistic missiles, which are primarily aimed at striking fixed targets like military bases or population centers, coastal defense cruise missiles serve a much more specific and, from a global economic perspective, genuinely alarming purpose. They're designed to threaten ships. A functioning coastal cruise missile battery, hidden inside a hardened underground facility and capable of being wheeled out, aimed, and fired against a passing tanker or naval vessel with relatively little warning, represents exactly the kind of persistent, low-cost, high-leverage threat that can single-handedly disrupt global shipping confidence, even without ever actually striking a target successfully. Every credible threat to a commercial vessel transiting that strait ripples out into global oil markets almost immediately, and Iran has understood that dynamic for years, which is exactly why it's invested so heavily in building hardened, dispersed coastal missile infrastructure specifically positioned to keep that threat alive, even under sustained American and Allied bombardment. Let's put the GBU-72 in context alongside the other bunker-busting weapons that have already seen extensive use throughout this same conflict, because understanding where it fits in that broader arsenal tells you something important about how American military planners have approached the layered problem of Iran's hardened infrastructure. The most famous of these weapons is obviously the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, the 30,000-pound behemoth that made its own combat debut back in June of 2025. When 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers dropped 14 of these weapons on Iran's Fordo uranium enrichment plant and the Natanz nuclear facility during what was officially designated Operation Midnight Hammer. That weapon remains, by a significant margin, the largest and most powerful conventional bunker buster in the American inventory, roughly 5.5 times heavier than the GBU-72, and it's specifically reserved for the very deepest, most heavily fortified targets, the kind of facilities we've discussed elsewhere in coverage of this war, buried hundreds of meters into solid granite mountains. But that immense size comes with real operational costs. Only the B-2 can carry it, meaning every mission involving the GBU-57 requires committing one of America's rarest and most strategically valuable aircraft. And the sheer scale of the weapon means it's simply not practical to use against every single hardened target that comes up throughout a sustained military campaign. That's exactly the gap the GBU-72 was built to fill. At 5,000 pounds, it can be carried by considerably more common platforms, the B-1B Lancer and the F-15E and F-15I strike fighters, all of which are available in far greater numbers than the handful of B-2s in the American fleet, and it can be deployed far more frequently and flexibly across a much wider range of missions without requiring the same level of strategic commitment each time. This layered approach becomes even clearer when you look at the full range of penetrating munitions that have already seen extensive use throughout this specific conflict before the GBU-72 even made its debut. There's the GBU-31 variant 3 Joint Direct Attack munition, essentially the bunker-busting version of the 2,000-pound class weapon built around the older BLU-0109 warhead, which has been used extensively against smaller, less deeply buried hardened targets throughout this war. There's the AGM-158 Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff missile, which lets aircraft strike hardened targets from well outside the range of most Iranian air defenses, trading some penetrating power for a dramatically improved launch platform survivability. And there's the ship-launched RGM-109, Tomahawk land attack missile, giving naval forces stationed in the Gulf the ability to contribute precision strikes against hardened coastal targets without needing to commit aircraft to the mission at all. The GBU-72 slots into this layered arsenal as a genuinely important middle option, more powerful and more capable against deeply buried targets than the 2,000-pound class weapons, but considerably more available and more flexibly deployable than the massive B-2 exclusive GBU-57. Having exactly this kind of graduated capability, matching the size and specialization of the weapon to the specific hardness and depth of each individual target, is exactly what allows a sustained air campaign like this one to actually work through thousands of separate hardened positions efficiently, rather than either wasting the rarest, most expensive weapons on targets that don't actually require that level of firepower, or failing to generate enough penetrating power against targets that genuinely do need it. There's also an interesting piece of open source intelligence history worth understanding here, because analysts studying this war closely had actually been tracking hints of the GBU-72's eventual combat debut for some time before Central Command formally confirmed it. Open source intelligence accounts, the kind of independent analysts who study circulating strike footage frame by frame looking for telltale signatures of specific weapon systems, had flagged possible GBU-72 use in earlier strikes against hardened Iranian ammunition sites weeks before the weapon's combat debut was officially confirmed, based on the specific blast patterns and secondary effects visible in footage of strikes against underground storage networks. That kind of open source detective work matters because it illustrates just how closely this entire conflict has been scrutinized by independent military analysts around the world, piecing together exactly what weapon systems are being employed and against what target categories, often well before official confirmation catches up with what the visual evidence already strongly suggested. When Central Command finally did confirm the GBU-72's combat use directly, describing the strikes against hardened Iranian anti-ship missile sites near the Strait, it validated weeks of that kind of careful, open-source analysis. And it also marked a genuinely significant escalation in the scope of Operation Epic Fury, signaling that American forces were now willing and able to reach into exactly the kind of deeply buried, hardened storage infrastructure that had previously been considered largely protected from anything short of the much rarer, much larger GBU-57. It's worth spending some additional time on the actual history of the target itself, because the coastal strip near Isfahan and along the Strait of Hormuz, where these strikes have concentrated, has featured prominently throughout multiple phases of this war, and understanding that history helps explain why it kept coming back into focus even after earlier rounds of bombing. Footage that circulated from strikes in the same general area back in June showed a chain reaction blast consistent with exactly this kind of deep penetrator weapon hitting underground infrastructure, producing the kind of secondary explosions that typically indicate a warhead detonating close enough to stored munitions or fuel to trigger a cascading series of additional blasts. That pattern, a single penetrating strike followed by multiple secondary detonations rippling outward, has become one of the most visually distinctive signatures throughout this entire conflict. And it's exactly the kind of effect the GBU-72's post-penetration detonation mechanism is specifically designed to produce when it successfully reaches a target, storing significant quantities of missile propellant or ordnance. The fact that strikes consistent with this weapon's signature had already been observed in the same general region months before Central Command formally confirmed the GBU-72's combat debut suggests this wasn't a one-time isolated use of the weapon, but rather part of a sustained, ongoing campaign specifically targeting this category of hardened coastal storage infrastructure across multiple separate strike windows throughout the broader conflict. There's also a meaningful comparison worth drawing between the GBU-72 and its predecessor, the GBU-28, because understanding exactly what improvements were made between these two generations of bunker-busting weapon tells you a lot about how American penetrator technology has evolved over the past 3.5 decades. The GBU-28 first entered service back in 1991, developed rapidly during the Gulf War, specifically to address an urgent need for a weapon capable of destroying Iraqi hardened command bunkers that existing American munitions simply couldn't reach. It's a laser-guided weapon in the same general weight class as the GBU-72, and it's remained in continuous service ever since, used not just by American forces but by Israel and South Korea as well, and employed as recently as the strike against Hezbollah's underground headquarters complex in Beirut, where subsequent reporting indicated 2,000-pound class BLU-109 bunker-busting bombs were likely used instead, given some uncertainty in early reporting about exactly which specific weapon had been employed in that particular strike. But laser guidance, while effective, comes with real operational limitations. It requires clear line of sight and active laser designation throughout the weapon's flight path, which can be complicated by weather, smoke, dust kicked up by earlier strikes in the same target area, or simply the tactical complexity of maintaining an active laser designation on a target while also managing the broader strike package around it. The GBU-72's shift to GPS and inertial navigation guidance eliminates that specific vulnerability entirely, allowing the weapon to reliably hit its intended aim point regardless of battlefield visibility conditions, which matters enormously when you're conducting the kind of sustained, high-tempo strike campaign this war has become, where waiting for perfect visual conditions before every single strike simply isn't operationally practical, given the sheer number of targets that need to be addressed. Let's also consider the broader industrial and logistical dimension of introducing a new weapon system into an active, ongoing conflict. Because this isn't simply a matter of pulling a different bomb off a shelf and loading it onto an aircraft. Every munition in the American arsenal requires its own dedicated supply chain, specialized storage and handling procedures, and trained ground crews capable of correctly loading and configuring the weapon onto whichever aircraft is tasked with delivering it. The fact that the GBU-72 had already been fully tested, validated, and certified for combat use back in 2021 meant that when the decision was eventually made to actually employ it in this conflict, the supporting infrastructure, the manufacturing pipeline, the trained personnel, the established loading procedures for both the B-1B and the F-15 variants was already largely in place rather than needing to be built from scratch under wartime pressure. That's precisely the strategic value of maintaining weapons like this in a certified but unused state for years at a time. It means that when a specific capability gap gets identified during an actual conflict, exactly the situation that appears to have played out here with Iran's coastal missile storage network, the weapon can be brought into active combat use relatively quickly, without the kind of lengthy development and testing delay that would be required if the entire program were being started from scratch in response to the immediate battlefield need. There's one more angle worth exploring before pulling this all together, and it concerns how Iran itself has responded, or more precisely, hasn't meaningfully been able to respond, to the introduction of this specific new capability. Throughout this entire war, Iran's public messaging strategy whenever a new American weapon system or a new category of target gets struck has followed a fairly consistent pattern, downplaying the actual damage inflicted while simultaneously projecting confidence that the underlying capability remains intact and operational. That's exactly the kind of messaging you'd expect from a government trying to maintain both domestic morale and a credible deterrent posture, even while absorbing genuine, verified losses to infrastructure it spent years and enormous resources building. But the specific technical nature of the GBU-72's post-penetration detonation mechanism makes this particular category of strike genuinely difficult to downplay convincingly, because the entire point of the weapon is to destroy exactly the kind of internal storage capacity, the missiles themselves and their support equipment, that would otherwise remain hidden from outside observation even after a strike. Unlike a strike against a visible above-ground target where damage assessment can rely at least partially on satellite imagery of external destruction, a successful GBU-72 strike against underground storage produces damage that's largely invisible from the outside, which means both sides are working with genuinely incomplete information about exactly how much of Iran's coastal missile stockpile has actually been destroyed versus how much remains intact and hidden beneath still standing surface terrain. That uncertainty cuts in Iran's favor for propaganda purposes in the short term, since it's much harder for outside observers to independently verify or dispute Iranian claims about what survived. But it also means Iranian military planners themselves likely face genuine uncertainty about exactly how much of their own coastal missile capability remains functional after each new round of strikes involving this specific weapon. Now let's talk about what this specific weapon's combat debut actually tells us about the broader trajectory of this war. Because introducing a genuinely new capability partway through a sustained conflict is never a decision made lightly. It reflects a deliberate strategic calculation about what's actually needed to achieve the campaign's objectives. Throughout the earlier phases of Operation Epic Fury, American and Allied forces focused heavily on more visible, more accessible targets, missile production facilities, command and control nodes, air defense systems, and coastal surveillance sites, the kind of infrastructure that, while still often hardened to some degree, generally didn't require the extreme penetrating capability of a dedicated deep burial weapon. The shift towards specifically targeting underground storage facilities holding coastal defense cruise missiles, and doing so with a weapon purpose-built for exactly that kind of deeply buried target, tells you that American intelligence assessments had identified this specific category of hidden, hardened coastal missile infrastructure as a priority that the existing toolkit wasn't adequately addressing. That's consistent with broader intelligence assessments that emerged throughout this war, indicating a significant percentage of Iran's coastal defense cruise missile capability had survived earlier rounds of strikes largely intact. precisely because that capability had been protected inside exactly the kind of hardened underground storage that conventional weapons struggle to defeat. Introducing the GBU-72 specifically against this target category represents a direct, deliberate response to that identified capability gap, an acknowledgement that simply hitting the visible surface-level infrastructure surrounding these coastal missile positions wasn't sufficient to actually eliminate the underlying threat, and that closing the gap required bringing an entirely new weapon into the fight. It's worth thinking through the aircraft and mission profile involved in delivering this weapon too, because the operational details matter for understanding how sustainable this kind of expanded targeting campaign actually is going forward. The B-1B Lancer, one of the primary platforms capable of carrying the GBU-72, is a supersonic heavy bomber originally developed as a nuclear-capable platform during the Cold War, subsequently converted entirely to conventional roles, and optimized for exactly the kind of sustained conventional warfare campaign this conflict has become, capable of carrying more than 75,000 pounds of mixed ordnance across 3 separate internal weapons bays. That kind of payload capacity means a single B-1B sortie can potentially carry multiple GBU-72 units alongside other munitions, allowing for efficient, high-volume strikes against multiple separate hardened coastal positions within a single mission, rather than requiring a dedicated sortie for each individual target. Combined with the F-15E and F-15I's ability to also carry this weapon, giving forward-deployed fighter wings in the region the ability to strike hardened coastal targets without needing to wait for bomber assets to become available, the GBU-72's flexible carriage options genuinely expand the operational tempo at which American forces can work through Iran's dispersed network of hardened coastal missile storage facilities, compared to relying exclusively on the much rarer B-2 and its GBU-57 payload for this entire category of target. Now, let's be honest about what a single strike, even one representing a genuinely significant new capability being introduced into the fight, actually accomplishes against a network as extensive and as deliberately dispersed as Iran's coastal missile infrastructure. This war has already produced more than 12,000 separate American strikes against targets across Iran, and throughout that entire campaign, the consistent pattern has been one of degradation rather than complete elimination. Iran's dispersed, redundant approach to protecting its most valuable military assets has proven remarkably resilient against sustained bombardment, precisely because the whole point of building this kind of hardened, distributed infrastructure was to survive exactly this type of extended pressure campaign. The GBU-72's combat debut against coastal missile storage facilities represents a genuine, meaningful expansion of American targeting capability, closing a real gap that had allowed a significant portion of Iran's coastal cruise missile arsenal to survive earlier strikes intact. But it would be a mistake to treat any single strike, even one involving a newly introduced weapon system, as a decisive turning point in isolation. The more accurate way to understand this development is as one additional tool in an already extensive arsenal, one that specifically improves American capability against a target category that had previously been underserved by existing weapons, incrementally closing the gap between what Iran has managed to hide and protect and what American forces are actually capable of finding and destroying. There's also a broader signal embedded in this specific weapon choice that's worth considering, because it speaks to how military planners think about escalation and proportionality throughout a sustained conflict like this one. Choosing to introduce the GBU-72, a 5,000-pound weapon carried by widely available platforms, rather than escalating toward even more extensive use of the 30,000-pound GBU-57, suggests a deliberate calibration, matching the actual hardness and depth of the coastal missile storage targets to an appropriately sized weapon, rather than defaulting to maximum available firepower for every single hardened target encountered throughout this campaign. That kind of calibrated, proportional approach to weapon selection reflects a broader military philosophy that's actually been fairly consistent throughout this entire war, applying exactly the amount of force judged necessary for each specific target category, reserving the rarest and most powerful weapons like the GBU-57 for genuinely exceptional targets like deeply buried nuclear enrichment facilities, while using more available, more flexible weapons like the GBU-72 for the broader, more numerous category of hardened but less extremely fortified positions that make up the bulk of Iran's dispersed missile infrastructure. There's also a longer-term precedent-setting dimension to this weapon's combat debut worth considering, one that extends well beyond just its immediate effect against Iran's coastal missile network. Every time a new munition gets validated under real combat conditions rather than controlled test environments, defense planners gain genuinely valuable data about how the weapon actually performs against real-world variations in soil composition, rock hardness, and structural design that no amount of testing at a facility like Eglin Air Force Base can fully replicate. That combat validation data doesn't just matter for how this specific war unfolds, It shapes how the GBU-72 gets employed in future conflicts against other adversaries who've also invested in hardened underground military infrastructure, a category of threat that extends well beyond Iran alone and touches on how the American military approaches deterrence against multiple potential adversaries around the world who've studied exactly the same defensive playbook. In that sense, this specific strike against Iran's coastal missile storage isn't purely a story about this one conflict. It's also, quietly, the first real-world proving ground for a weapon that's likely to remain a core part of the American bunker-busting arsenal for decades to come, providing the kind of hard-won operational lessons that only actual combat use, rather than years of controlled testing, can genuinely deliver. So, where does this leave the broader picture of how this specific dimension of the war, the fight over Iran's hidden coastal missile capability, is likely to develop from here? The introduction of the GBU-72 into active combat use signals that American forces now have a genuinely expanded toolkit for addressing exactly the category of target that intelligence assessments had flagged as remaining substantially intact despite months of prior strikes elsewhere in the country. That expanded capability doesn't guarantee rapid, complete elimination of Iran's coastal missile threat, given how consistently this entire war has demonstrated Iran's ability to disperse, harden, and rebuild capability faster than any single strike wave can fully eliminate it. But it does represent a meaningful narrowing of the gap between what Iran has tried to hide and protect along its coastline and what American forces are actually equipped to find and destroy, and given how directly that coastal missile threat connects to global shipping confidence and, by extension, global oil markets. Even incremental progress in closing that gap carries real strategic weight well beyond the immediate tactical significance of any individual strike. What do you think this new weapon's combat debut actually signals about how the rest of this war plays out? Do you think the GBU-72 becomes a genuinely routine part of the ongoing campaign against Iran's hardened coastal infrastructure, steadily grinding down that dispersed network over the coming months? Or do you think Iran's demonstrated ability throughout this entire conflict to rebuild and disperse capability faster than it can be permanently eliminated means this remains an open-ended fight, regardless of how many new weapon systems get introduced along the way? It's worth remembering, too, that every previous weapon introduced throughout this war, from the 2,000-pound class JDAM variants through to the GBU-57's dramatic debut against Fordo, initially generated exactly the same kind of speculation about whether it would represent a decisive turning point, and in every case, the honest answer turned out to be more complicated, real, meaningful progress against specific target categories, paired with an adversary that kept finding ways to disperse, rebuild, and adapt, rather than simply conceding defeat after any single new capability entered the fight. Let me know your take in the comments below, because this is exactly the kind of story where understanding the specific technical capability of a weapon, like the GBU-72, what it can and can't actually achieve against different categories of hardened targets, matters just as much as the broader strategic and political context surrounding why it was used when and where it was. And it's the kind of detail that separates a genuinely informed read on this war from just watching another round of explosion footage scroll past. If this breakdown helped you understand why this particular weapon's combat debut represents something genuinely significant rather than just another entry in a long list of strikes, share it with someone who's been following this war but hasn't had the technical details behind exactly what these bunker-busting weapons are actually capable of. And make sure you're subscribed, because as this campaign against Iran's hardened infrastructure continues to evolve, expect to see this same layered arsenal, from the 2,000-pound class weapons all the way up through the GBU-72 and the GBU-57, continuing to feature prominently in exactly the kind of target-by-target campaign that's come to define this entire war. Thanks for watching this one all the way through, and we'll keep tracking exactly how this develops, because a weapon that sat ready and certified for nearly 5 years before finally seeing its first combat use is exactly the kind of story that tends to keep generating follow-up developments as it gets employed again and again across whatever hardened targets come next in this ongoing campaign.